Hi everybody and welcome to another episode of Property Question Time. And with me today, I'm super excited to have the most successful entrepreneur that I know and have met. He's created the largest property development company in Central and Eastern Europe. He's helped open a bank. He's created a mortgage company and he's developed shopping centres of over 2 million square feet. And when he sold his portfolio just before the crash, it was sold for over $250 million.
Roughly, yeah.
And he is the one and only Paul Oberschneider of Ober-Haus.
Thanks for having me.
And he started out with just with $400. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So Paul, thanks for giving me time. I know you're super busy.
That's all right.
We've met a couple of times. I've heard you speak, and I'm always impressed with your journey. And that was one of the reasons I felt that people could hear quite an inspirational journey. So if we could start from the beginning. So obviously you sold your property info for over $250 million. But before that, before the $400 journey, you used to be in, I think, was it Wall Street?
Yeah, I was one of those rare breed of people that used to stand on the floors of the exchange and shout and scream all day.
Right, okay.
So I started as a runner for a company called A.G. Becker in Chicago on the Board of Trade, on the CBOE in fact. And then I moved to the New York Futures Exchange and then later the American Stock Exchange.
Is that Wall Street, yeah?
Yeah, none of which are there anymore. I mean, all these exchanges have closed and the open outcry system, I mean, that's been replaced by computers now. So,
okay.
But, you know, there was a time in an age where, you know, those were very coveted jobs and very exciting, and you had to be quite young to do it because it's very very high pressure. But that's what I did. So I traded derivatives, equity options on the New York Futures Exchange and on the American Stock Exchange for roughly 10 years.
Oh wow, okay. So was it, so you worked on Wall Street, was it anything like, I don't know, you probably watched the film, The Wolf of Wall Street, is it anything like that at all? I
mean, parts of it. I mean, you know, it depends which part you're talking about. I mean,
all of it.
You know, I think the 1980s was a very interesting time. So, you know, there are a lot of movies that have been made about the 1980s, and I think generally, thematically, a lot of this stuff was true. I mean, but you know, we were out a lot. We, you know, partied a lot. We, you know, you've got A-type personalities looking for risk and danger, and you know, the 1980s was all about push, and you know, kind of greed, and you know, I was kind of right in the middle of that.
Okay. So. And how old were you then?
Oh, I was 20.
Oh right, it was just the right age. Okay, right.
You know,
okay.
20, young kid in New York City.
Yeah.
You know, it was a free-for-all.
Okay. So obviously, 20 years old. I think you were started off from Illinois. That's where you were born.
Yeah.
So how did it all end in New York for you? What happened?
Well, you know, I mean, there were some people that were smart that could turn the switch off and turn it back on again, and I really wasn't one of those people. So, you know, when I switched it was on all the time. And after about 10 years of being in that environment and running that kind of risk and being, you know, out all night and doing all that, you know, after 10 years, it really took a toll on me. So I left in 1987.
Okay.
Yeah, basically. You know, I sort of started in 79, 80.
Right.
So, you know, I had almost a good 10 years down there.
Right, okay. Did you make lots of money?
No, actually, it was really up and down, very, very chaotic. You know, market makers provided liquidity to the markets. We were scalping for eighths and quarters of points. It was a lot of hard work for, you know, one day it could be a great big return, but the next day, you know, you could be on the wrong side of the market. And, you know, we were trading our own capital. I mean, we had private capital behind us, but, you know, it was very stressful.
Okay.
And at the end, you know, there wasn't a lot left to show for it except for a very tired body.
Right, okay. And did you take a bit of a break, or what happened? Did you,
yeah, so I took a break, a couple years. I went back to school, and which is something I hadn't done. You know, you don't really need a university degree to go trade options and futures on the exchange floor. So, but I went back to school, put myself through school, and when I'd finished that, I was actually on my way to grad school at the time, and I decided to take a break and go to Central Eastern Europe, to Tallinn, Estonia, specifically, which is where my father had been from, and really just to kind of connect the dots.
Okay.
I mean, it was nothing more than that. It was more of a personal exploratory journey, you know, find your roots kind of thing.
Okay.
And
you went for 3 weeks, I think.
Yeah, I was supposed to go for a couple of weeks and come back and go to grad school, and you know, I thought that was the path that I was meant to take, and of course, that's not what happened.
Right.
You know?
Okay. So there you were, and I know it was just, I think in that, during that period, you just had come out of communist rule. So, and then how did it start? How did this journey from just going to Estonia, it started, but selling a company of £250 million. So how did it all start then?
Kind of like, you know, I mean, if you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, it was a little bit Forrest Gumpish.
I mean,
okay. You know, I was there, I got involved with some people, you know, things were very dynamic in these markets back then in '92, and you know, there were a lot of things happening. So you had the old Soviet legacy of older people that were being replaced by young people, and guys were starting businesses, banks, insurance companies, whatnot. And so it was a great place to kind of parachute into because there were opportunities everywhere.
Right.
You know, the interesting thing was, in hindsight, looking back, I mean, if I knew what I knew today, you know, I would have never done what I did, because it was just, you know, I went to a place where I didn't speak the language.
Right, okay.
You know, I didn't know anybody.
Right.
And, you know, I was just on holiday, basically. So, you know, imagine just kind of dropping into China, you know, I mean, where everybody's different and they speak a language that you don't. But, you know, the interesting part was, I started helping young guys write business plans for their businesses to get funded, and I started making money at that. It was actually quite interesting.
Right.
And I was writing these plans in English, and guys were getting funding from banks, and so I became quite known for being able to do that.
Okay.
And made a fair amount of money over a 6-month period of time. In the meantime, I wrote to my grad school and said, you know what, I'll be back next year.
Right.
And I did that 2 or 3 times until they finally told me, well, actually, no, you know. But so that led to my hooking up with a guy who was actually starting a bank. He needed some help establishing a credit department. None of us knew what we were doing, but it really didn't matter because nobody knew anyway.
Right, okay.
So, you know, we were all kind of putting things together as we went. And so we started this credit department for the Bank of Tallinn, and that grew to, I don't know, 50, 60 people with a loan book of about 100 million, you know, at the time, euros. We were funding primarily, we were actually very much a merchant, kind of Renaissance merchant rapacious lenders. So we were loaning to own, basically.
Okay.
So we didn't lend on assets that we didn't want that we actually weren't interested in.
Right. Okay.
So our terms were slightly egregious, but we put money out in the market, and if we were lucky, we ended up owning stuff.
Right.
Which is how that particular bank grew.
Right. Okay.
And we were doing a lot of large state privatizations and things like that. But what was interesting is it gave me an opportunity to be in the catbird seat, if you will.
What does that mean, Steve?
Well, it just gave me an elevated position in the market to see what was going on. Fortunately, everybody spoke English, you know,
at that level.
Mm-hmm. So I felt very comfortable with that. And one of the things I was always interested in was real estate, because it just seemed like, you know,
safe bet. Yeah.
Well, you had this nation emerging, young middle class. I mean, that's probably going a bit too far back then, but you know, you had people that wanted to improve their lives. They were working hard. They were making changes, and living in old Soviet type.
All those blocks that tenants.
Yeah, all those blocks.
Right.
And so one of the first things that I did when I was working at the bank was I needed a place to live.
Yeah.
So I started out as a single unit developer, if you will.
Right.
I mean, I built my first flat, my first apartment, basically for myself.
Right.
Because I wanted someplace better to live. And I did that, and I built it next to the U.S. Embassy.
Okay. Good move.
But not intentionally, just because that's the neighborhood that I kind of lived in.
Okay.
And so I built that, and once I had built it, I thought, somebody approached me and said, would you rent it to the embassy? And so I thought, oh, sure, why not? And, you know, and back then there was very little quality apartments in the market. So the embassy paid me quite a bit of money per month for this flat that I had built. So I never moved in, which meant that I needed to build another one.
Right, okay.
And I did that. And rather than move in again, I rented that out.
Right.
So, you know, this kind of carried on for a year and a half or so, where I had built like 6 or 7 of these units and rented them out to embassy personnel, and, you know, created a little bit of a good cash flow. And along the way, you know, I had sort of started being shadowed by brokers and people who knew that I was buying stuff.
Right.
So they kind of all started joining me bit by bit. And so we started this company called Overhouse back in '93 with about 3-4 people. We were working out of a friend's office,
right,
and, you know, off his couch basically.
Right, okay.
And, you know, after about a month and a half, there were 35 of us, and my friend was like, you gotta, you know, you can't stay here anymore because you're disrupting my business. He had a design studio.
Right.
And so we got our first office, and it was just all brokers basically looking for deals for me, basically.
Okay, right.
And then of course that led to looking for deals for other people, and so that was the beginning of an agency, a real estate agency business. And we had one office, and you know, there were other people in the market obviously doing the same thing.
Yeah. But were they Americans or the local guys?
No, all locals, you know,
right,
and, you know, well-funded and had been in the market. And so we were just like this little speck we didn't even appear on the map.
Right.
You know? Nobody paid attention to us. We were just this crazy American building flats, selling it to the U.S. or renting them to the embassies.
Right.
And so nobody paid much attention to us, which was actually, in hindsight, a very good thing.
Okay.
Because a lot of foreigners that went into Central and Eastern Europe with big plans and big money, and, you know, the locals basically took all the knowledge and took all their money and then sent them home eventually.
Okay.
But we had no money. We didn't have any big plans. There was no business plan at all. It was just, we were buying apartments and renovating them and renting them. So we were well under the radar. And that allowed us actually, that was a unique position to be in because nobody cared. What we were doing.
You were too small.
We were too small. Nobody cared. Nobody paid attention. And, bit by bit, we opened a second office and then a third, and we started raising a little bit of money locally, and pretty soon we had 5-6 offices in a particular region.
Yes, in Estonia, was it? Yeah.
At that time, it was only Estonia, but fast forward, and we had opened offices. Eventually, we opened like 35, 36 offices in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Poland. Throughout Poland, and we had about, I don't know, close to 400 some brokers on the ground, and we were a full service agency, so we did, buying, we represented buyers and sellers, we did rentals, we did commercial, we did residential, we did valuations for the banks, the local banks, and so that particular business allowed us to integrate into other areas like property management, project management, and development. And development was, up until that point, it was just me doing apartments, basically, putting portfolios of flats together. And by then what I was doing is I was selling those to foreigners and then building another portfolio and selling that to foreigners in order to generate cash. And then, of course, you had the banks that were starting to lend. Liquidity was coming into the market. So we were on an upward curve. And we were using leverage like to the maximum. We'd buy stuff, we'd renovate it, we'd revalue it, we'd take the money out from the bank, we'd put that into a new deal, and we just kept doing that. And when the market's going up...
So what year would this be at money?
This would be sort of 96, 97, when the market's going up, you can do that. It's easy, because you've got the wind to your back, and you've got liquidity behind you, and asset prices are going up, and
bit of experience as well now.
So I mean, in hindsight, I should have done 100 times more, but we really up until that point there was really no business plan. There was we didn't know enough to write a business plan. If we had written it, it would have been wrong. But in about 96, 97, it all started to look like a business. So we actually did start putting ideas on paper and writing what we thought would be a business. And, there was the agency business, there was the mortgage company that we started because we were trying to service our clients and we were selling loans to the banks. And then we started developing stuff. And by developing, I mean, rather than one-off apartments, by now we were doing whole buildings. So we were buying, buildings in town and renovating, say, maybe 10, 20 flats at a time. And that's where we were at about 96, 97. And people started to take a little bit of notice. Not so much the locals, but foreigners that were now coming into the market looking for investment opportunities. And what made us different than the locals was we spoke their language. So guys would come from London, they'd meet me, we could have a conversation. So I became kind of an easy conduit for money flowing in of a particular kind. So we never went to the local markets for money other than bank debt. I was very good at actually building relationships with the banks, primarily because I'd been in one. So we were very on friendly terms with about 3 or 4 banks that would always provide us the debt, But on the equity side, we had partners
from London.
Foreign partners. And raising equity at that time was not easy. These were very shallow markets, very small. You know, the first thing an institutional client, you know, investor would ask is, you know, how can you scale this? How deep are the markets?
Right.
Oh, they're too small. You know, we don't really see an opportunity here. So we didn't get a lot of traction, but, you know, at a chance meeting one night at dinner, I met a guy who was an economist who introduced me to somebody else, and blah, blah, blah. And so eventually we managed to convince a very big New York institutional player called Apollo, who was looking for operating partners in the market in Central and Eastern Europe to back. And so we got our first piece of institutional funding from Apollo probably in 96, 97.
And how big were investments for them?
That was about $30 million.
Wow,
dollars.
Wow,
and that was a lot of money for us, for anybody
at
that time. But it allowed us to do a lot more things. And so we built our first couple hotels. You know, we were always solving a problem. You know, whether it was building a flat for me, that was solving a problem for me. Whether it was, you know, if we did our agency business, we were solving a problem for the customer. We were very much initially embassy focused. So
U.S. embassy focused.
U.S. other embassies as well.
So
we were like the agency business that dealt with foreigners. Later on, we became very local, but that was a bit later. And by then, we had started to grow into these other countries, and we started building some grocery-anchored retail. So we started out with our first one was a rundown, I would call it, community strip center, whatever you want, and we renovated that, and we filled it with shops and a grocery store, and that worked. The next one we did was a brand new bespoke, which we had never done before, so we built that. That worked. And, you know, we basically, it was, we would get a Scandinavian grocery tenant on a 10 plus 10 year lease. We would take that to the bank and say, well, 50% of our project is pre-let, and the bank would just give us the money for the rest. And so we very quickly started building these grocery anchored commercial retail centers. And that's eventually what all I did. Whereas people that worked with me and my colleagues, they did other things. So I became very much development focused. My partner at the time, he was very much running the agency business and building that out. Somebody else was doing the mortgage and the property management. So we all had we were all siloed in different compartments in doing what we did. You know, I was the chairman, but actually, you know, my partner actually grew that other business. I didn't do that. You know, he did that. So you know, the business grew organically, and once we demonstrated a certain amount of success and track record, then of course getting other institutional clients, investors in was relatively easy. You know, we did business with the EBRD, the IFC, DEG Bank, Emo East, Granger, Heitman, even Heinz, I think, came to visit us, although we didn't do anything. Apollo, of course, Citigroup, and so our development book grew very quickly.
We started writing business plans. When things were going great, so when did you feel that it's time to get out? Because when things are going great, normally people don't want to get out. So what made you convince yourself to get out? When did it happen?
Well, it was a number of things. it's not just any one thing. I mean, I would love to be able to sit here today and say, you know, I looked at a graph and I thought, okay, all these statistics mean, you know, it's time to go. It wasn't like that at all. By 2007, we had built a pretty well-oiled and well-functioning machine.
Right.
That was working across a number of different countries, fully integrated. And I made the mistake of not being able to see the next step.
Okay.
Which could have been even bigger.
Wow. Okay.
But I had sort of mentally plateaued.
Okay.
And I had gotten to a point where I had achieved pretty much all the things that I thought in the back of my mind that I wanted to achieve. So part of me was bored.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I started in 91, 92. It was now 2007.
Right.
Everything was easy. We had made a pretty significant amount of money. We had great cash flow, and I mentally plateaued.
Okay.
That was the first thing. The second thing was that we were being approached by a lot of Scandinavians.
Right.
That were interested in our businesses, and they tend to have a reputation of always sort of being late at the party.
Right. I believe a guy got Elvis told you
yeah,
something.
No. So way back in '92, you know, I was talking to a guy. This guy, his nickname was Elvis. And he was a Finnish Swede living in Estonia. And,
right.
And he was talking about how the Finns are always late.
Right.
You know, and I just didn't. I never really paid attention much to that. But then in 2007, when I got a phone call from a Finnish private equity firm asking us about our businesses, the green light went on in my head. Right. You know, I had this sort of light bulb moment, and it allowed me to kind of look around and take stock, if you will. Right. So maybe using that mental plateau and being a little bored, I used that as an excuse, and I said, you know what? Yeah. We're I feel we're at the top of the market. Right. And we need to sell. So that was like another adventure for me. Right. Now I could get busy again selling stuff. Yeah. So we did that. So we started that process, and you know, by chance, we were very lucky to have exited most of our assets by just prior to the crisis in 2008.
Wow. Okay.
Excuse me.